Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to your Psych 121 lecture. So this week we are talking about development. So we're talking in chapter 14 of our text, development over the lifespan. Now, as you can imagine, this is a huge topic, and there's no way that we're going to be able to do justice to all of the components and aspects of development. And so we are going to do a very, very brief overview of most of the areas of development. By way of beginning, I'd like to read the land acknowledgement. So, as we engage in remote teaching and learning today, I'd like to acknowledge that the Saskatoon campus of the University of Saskatchewan is on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. I'd also like to recognize that some may be attending this course from other traditional Indigenous lands. I ask that you take a moment to make your own land acknowledgement to the peoples of those lands. In doing so, we're actively participating in reconciliation as we navigate our time in this course, learning and supporting each other. Now, I'd like to take a little bit of time and speak about some important theories of development. Now, some of these theories are kind of piecemeal, and you're going to say to yourself, well, John, this wasn't really in the textbook. And I'm going to say, I know, it actually is a little bit later on, but we're going to bring them in now, because this is really where they fit. If we're talking about development, we really need to talk about the theories of how do we develop. So, when I'm talking about development, I'm talking about the physiological, the behavioral, cognitive, and social changes that occur throughout human life. And development begins at conception. So, at the moment when the father's sperm unites with the mother's egg uh, through prenatal development in the womb. Now, in terms of stages, we talk about conception and prenatal development. We talk about infancy, and so that's the period between birth and until around 1 year of age. Then we talk about childhood, which is really that period between infancy and the onset of puberty. Then we talk about adolescence. So those are the years between the onset of puberty to the beginning of adulthood. And so that kind of covers a range of ages from about 10 to 24. Now, maybe you're saying, wait, like, aren't you an adult when you're 18? Well, no, not really according to psychology. We'll talk a little bit about that at another video. And then we talk about adulthood. And so adulthood also has kind of these phases of emerging, early, middle, and older adulthood. And then old age is kind of a subset of adulthood, and that's the time of preparations for and the eventual facing of that final developmental marker, which is death. Now, many theorists have developed lifespan development theories. And so we'll look at some of those theories, but in addition to that, as people, we also know that there are these stages of development. And each one of these stages of development have kind of unique physical, cognitive, and emotional challenges that define that stage and that makes it so different from other stages. Now, the earliest theories about development were what we'd call stage theories of development. And so we call them stage theories because there were these unique, distinct phases or stages that are qualitatively different from each other. Now, we kind of know now that, development isn't really as smooth as that. We don't really just hit one stage and then the stage ends, boom, then the next day a new stage begins. We know that there's a fluidity that happens with development. And so we now know that stages aren't necessarily the best way to describe things, and yet these theories are kind of important because they set the stage for later theories of personality and development. So we gotta go first to Freud. Freud, for all of the things he's done, one of the, I guess, kind of profound areas that we know about Freud is really his psychosexual stages of development. And so this was really kind of mainly a theory of personality and really kind of abnormal personality or things like that. But, at the same time, it's also helpful for us to understand development. So this was actually the first stage theory of development, which makes it very unique and important to kind of know about. And the big picture idea for this is that it's based on this idea that sexual energy changes as a child matures and moves through several stages. So the first stage that Freud identified is what's called the oral phase. During the oral phase, which is between birth to 1 year of age, there's sexual gratification that's gained via the mouth. So during this time, a child would be breastfeeding. They would perhaps beginning to engage in self-soothing behaviors like thumb sucking or using a soother or a pacifier. In a later part of the stage, teeth become a defense against the outside world. So Freud thought that biting teaches a child that they can act upon their world and maybe use that as a way to get get things or protect themselves from others. Now, Freud believed that if a baby becomes fixated in this stage, all other stages of life will seem too daunting and they'll continue to express their unconscious desires orally. So, for example, for adults, they would express these unconscious oral impulses through kissing, through smoking, overeating, biting pencils, or chewing on their nails. And so, the common personality traits that Freud felt really indicated that someone was fixated in this stage was that they were demanding, narcissistic, impatient, jealous, depressed, kind of that feeling of emptiness, mistrustful, pessimistic. They would have moments of rage and a little care or regard for others. Have I ever mentioned that Freud really liked smoking cigars? So what do you think? Was Freud stuck in the oral phase? I don't know. Freud then went on to say, well, if a child successfully passes through this oral stage, they'll move into what's called the anal stage of sexual gratification. And this occurs between the ages of 2 to about 3. And during this time, sexual gratification occurs via the anus and the expulsion of feces. So Freud argued that during this time, the developmental task that a child would engage in is this balance between eliminating their feces or retaining it, kind of the balance of pleasure with punishment. So, for example, pooping your diaper might be nice because you don't have to stop playing, but at the same time, it may also lead to disapproval from your parent. So Freud felt that during this phase, a parent's response to this toilet training process was critical. So if you praised your child lots, your child would grow up to be a generous person. But if they're punished, they would develop an anal character. And so when we're talking about someone with an anal personality or who was anal retentive, they would be orderly, stingy, and obstinate. And this is all Freud's language coming out here. Well, after this stage, if a child successfully passed through the oral and the anal stage, it would come to the phallic stage. And so would occur between ages 4 through about 5. And during this time, the zone of pleasure, the erogenous zone, shifts to the genitals. So masturbation becomes almost kind of a universal thing. So, little kids can't keep their hands out of their pants. They're always playing with their private parts. Now, Freud also believed that this stage would occur slightly differently depending on the sex. And so we talked about this idea of like an Electra or an Oedipus complex. So if you're a male, the Oedipus complex is this idea that you would become jealous of your father loving your mother, and so there would be this desire in your life to perhaps kill your opposite sex or your same sex parent. And when we learn that we can't, then we kind of find our way in this world, but that this was kind of a very important driver of this phallic behavior. Now, after this time, things would kind of go through this cooling off period, this latency period between ages 5 through about puberty. And during this time, a child's sexual drive is suppressed through punishment, and a child begins to direct their energy into school, friends, hobbies, and all that good kind of stuff. But after puberty onwards, we're back into this genital phase, and so now our autoerotic behaviors for satisfaction of sexual urges kind of decrease as our sexual impulses actually become directed towards another person. So the genitals, again, are the primary erogenous zone, and so all of this excess sexual energy, if we can't just go out and have sex all the time, we've got to do something with this energy. And so we've got to sublimate this. And so, we have to use things like masturbation if we can't find a partner, or we have to perhaps even rise above and sublimate this energy into art or creativity or helpful ways of dealing with this excess energy. Now, Freud had a very interesting kind of conceptualization, if the other things that I've just said were not interesting enough. And so Freud believed that you would only reach psychological maturity if you could pass through all of these previous stages in an ideal manner. But the reality is Freud never actually spent the time conceptualizing this stage because he didn't believe that people could realistically arrive at this stage. He believed everyone would get fixated somewhere along the way, that we get stuck in the psychosocial development. Now, as you can see with this theory, there would be some critiques. So again, some of the main critiques from others would be that there's this huge, heavy focus on sexual processes to the exclusion of every other process. Where does language development fit in? Where does cognitive development fit in? What about social development? None of those things are addressed by this stage theory. Again, the same critique always for the psychodynamic school is this idea that the theories are not testable. They're so broad and they've never been operationally defined. So how do we actually test whether or not this is a real thing? The other critique here is that this is a very deterministic theory. So basically, Freud believed that your personality was set in stone at age 5, and there was nothing you could do after that point in time to change or develop or somehow, shift who you become. And again, another theory, a critique that always comes back to the psychodynamic theories, that is a very large and a very redundant theory. It's very hard to actually find specific testable hypotheses or things we can find and make very useful in Freud's theories. Now, after Freud came one of his proteges, and so that'd be Erikson. And so he, came out of the psychodynamic school, but he, instead of focusing on sexual development, he said, what if we focused on the psychosocial stages of development? So he really believed, Freud's theory is too limited in scope. It's really only a 0 to 5 theory. And Erikson argued that if we cannot neglect to look at what the impact of society and culture is on development, that these things are important, and that development looks different in different places of the world because of the impact of both society and culture. Now, Erikson developed a pretty unique theory where he believed that you've got to pass through 8 phases. And if you're successful, then you gain an ego strength, something that you're going to be able to use later on, another tool in the tool belt that you can pull out in another point in your life. But if you fail, this is where you would develop a core pathology. And so for Erikson, the idea wasn't that we would successfully go through every single stage, but overall we wanted to have kind of a balancing of the scales over the lifetime. We wanted to have more ego strengths than core pathologies so that we could actually develop and do well. Now, we're not going to go over all of these all of these particular stages, but I'd like for you just to take a look at the left-hand side, and I'd like for you to look at the age bands for these stages. So we've got 8 stages that take us all the way from infancy down to old age. Now, as you can see, stage 1, 2, 3, 4, the age bands are fairly narrow, right? Even stage 5, right? We've got these very narrow age bands of about, 1 to 3 years, down to stage 5 are at about 5 years or so. But then once we hit adulthood, the age bands become very, very large, all right? So I want you to keep that as a note. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. But basically here, we've got a list of all of the crises that we face. So for example, during infancy, we have to face this crisis of either learning that we can basically trust that people are good and that someone will take care of our needs, or we develop mistrust. And so if the ego strength that we have, if we come through this is hope, we can hope that things will work out because we know that in general people are good and the world is generally safe. But if we don't go through this well, the core pathology we develop is withdrawal, and then we will probably never really socially engage with others. Well, so each of these stages has its own kind of crisis that we kind of face, right? So during early childhood, that potty training time, right? We've got the big crisis of autonomy versus shame and doubt. So can we do things independently and do it successfully? Will we develop this ego strength of will and purpose? Or do we develop a core pathology of compulsion? Right? So each of these stages has a very specific kind of developmental task that's tied with it that either leads to a strength or to a core pathology. Now, the critiques for Erikson's theory is too that he does a great job, like I pointed out, of attention to detail in the youngest years, but in the older years, his theory becomes rather spaced and the age bands become very, very large. Is it possible that there could be in-between stages faced by people? Well, we do know that there are. If we jump back for just a second, we can kind of see here. So we talk about adolescence till about 18ish and then young adulthood, but we know now too that there is really a delay in adulthood that has occurred due to many different kind of reasons. And so where does emerging adulthood fit into this, right? Young adulthood is not created the same between the ages of 19 to 30. There are different stages that I think are occurring during that time, as well as throughout our lifehood, right? So 31 to 60, I mean, that's a lot of time that happens there. During that time, you may have kids that leave, you may divorce, you may have several careers. There are many significant moments that occur during that 30-year gap that seems that one stage couldn't accurately capture all of those things. Another thing here with the psychosocial theory is, again, it's a good framework. It's a helpful framework. Even from a clinical perspective, it can be very helpful to talk to people about some of the things that they're going through. But this is not, again, necessarily a falsifiable, testable kind of theory. And so this is kind of part of, again, kind of bringing to light that there really is no perfect theory, but um, I guess, frameworks or kind of rubrics or touch points that we can kind of look at and say, well, maybe this could be it. But we just haven't really done the work of testing this out quite well. Well, those were both kind of stage lifespan development theories. Well, what about a theory that is just specifically looking at cognitive development? Well, if we were looking for that, we've got to look at Jean Piaget's cognitive theory of development. And Piaget, again, was another stage theorist, and he argued that development occurs in these unique and distinct stages. Each stage occurs at a specific time, sequentially, in a way that allows the child to think about the world using the new abilities that they've gained. And so Piaget believed that there are these four major stages. We've got the sensory motor stage, which is between that birth to 2 years, the pre-operational stage between 2 to 7, concrete operational between 7 to 11, and then formal operational. And so each of these stages have their own characteristics of how the child explores the world and what they actually attain at the end of that. Well, let's talk a little bit about that. So the sensory motor stage begins at birth and lasts until around age 2. And so during this stage, babies form their first schemas, their first kind of cognitive maps of the world by using their primary senses. So by motor movement, by sensory motor exploration, what they hear, what they see, what they touch, what they taste, how they interact and act on their world. So during this time, they're using those direct senses. And if they don't perceive objects, the objects don't exist to a baby. And so the stage attainment, the thing that's attained when we go through this sensory motor stage, is something called object permanence, and that is a child's ability to know that an object exists even when the object cannot be perceived. This also occurs around 8 months of age, and is likely the reason why we also begin to see around that age that kids begin to act strange, because they're now aware that their mother continues to exist, or the primary caregiver continues to exist even when that caregiver is not with them. Well, after that stage, and after successfully passing through this stage, we come into the pre-operational stage, which begins around age 2 and lasts until about 7 years of age. And during this pre-operational stage, we're using we're using language, and we're beginning to think slightly more abstractly about objects, with a capacity that we can actually begin to form mental images of them. However, the understanding at this stage is very intuitive, and kids don't really know how to reason well. And in fact, if you kind of give them logic tasks or ask them why things are the way they are, their answers are intuitive compared to being really abstract. Okay? So the thinking here is pre-operational. So they lack the ability to operate on or to transform objects mentally. And that's that whole operational piece that we're talking about, is that Piaget is really waiting for kids to be able to operate on or to transform objects in a mental capacity. Now, for young kids at this age, they tend to be very egocentric. They're unable to see and understand other people's viewpoints, and at this stage too, they begin to develop theory of mind, which is the ability to take another person's viewpoint. And it begins to increase rather rapidly during this stage, but it's not a complete kind of thing. They begin to realize that different people can experience different things. So they can begin to realize that maybe, that somebody else can have a different emotion or a different response to something that they can. But again, it's still very pre-operational. From this point in time, we move into what is called a concrete operational stage. And so the kind of key words here are concrete. So it's not abstract, it's just concrete operational. So they can begin to operate on objects in a mental capacity, but in a very concrete, literal fashion. All right. So at this point in time, you can see that they can begin to kind of use abstract concepts in a little bit of a better way. So you begin to see they are able to understand time and space and numbers in a meaningful way, and that they develop something called conservation. And conservation is a great task, which basically it shows that an object changes to the The form of an object doesn't mean that the quantity of the object changes. So, for example, if you pour milk into two different glasses, the amount can still be the same even if the glasses, one is a taller glass and one is a fatter, shorter glass. Now, finally, at around age 11, we get to the formal operational stage. And during this stage, we can think in abstract terms and we can use scientific and philosophical lines of thought. We can use deductive reasoning. So, if this happens, then that would be something like that. And at this stage, children become capable of imagining situations that might be, rather than those that just exist. So, whereas in the concrete operational, understanding what might be would be a very complicated thing, during this stage, we see that kids are able to really do these tasks quite well. Now, like every other theory, there's also some critiques. One of the main being that development really occurs in continuous waves rather than these discrete stages. Development is not a smooth kind of thing. There are many kind of bumps and jags along the way. The other thing that's interesting to note is that Piaget, for his sample, his theory was based only on his personal children, on his kids. And so all of his writing and theorizing was based on what he saw his kids doing at particular times in their lives. Now, in actual studies of Piaget's model, we do know that even preschoolers can engage in perspective taking in a meaningful kind of way. All right, so whereas Piaget would believe that initially in that kind of pre-operational stage we might see a little bit of it, we actually know that preschoolers can do it quite reliably. We also know that some of these cognitive abilities are evident much earlier than Piaget believes. So, for example, with an 8-year-old child, you can actually talk with them about what if situations, because that is something that cognitively they're able to do. Now, according to Piaget, they would still be in the concrete operational stage, and yet they're already able to engage in formal operational tasks. The other thing too that is so important is that culture influences cognitive development, and different cultures place different emphases on what is or is not important for cognitive development. Now, if we begin to talk about culture, we've got to take one more stop. We've got to talk a little bit about Vygotsky. And Vygotsky created what's called his social cultural theory. And Vygotsky really believed that learning is a social process, and the social interaction plays a fundamental role in the development of cognition, of thinking, reasoning abilities. And so for Vygotsky, he believed that cognitive development occurs through kind of this intersection of culture, because culture teaches us what is important. It teaches us the morals, the values, and the beliefs of our community members. He also believed that language, which is at the root of culture, is a driver for cognitive development. And finally, that our learning occurs and our development occurs because we're learning what our role is within a very specific prescribed community. Now, for Vygotsky, teachers play not an instructional role in learning, but a facilitative role. So that is, a teacher would use wise questioning to guide an exchange between themselves and a student to help them come to an answer. Discussions wouldn't just focus on facts, but would be comprehensive and meaningful. And that learning actually occurs within small groups as well. And so Vygotsky's theory of social constructivism is actually heavily applied right now in classrooms, actually in most elementary and kind of middle school classrooms. Well, one of the things I think that is helpful about Vygotsky's theory is that he believed that learning is limited by a learner's what he called the zone of proximal development. And that's the area that a student's cognitively prepared for, but maybe they need some additional kind of social interaction to develop this skill a little bit better. And so the way that we would help a child is if they're cognitively ready for this, but they haven't had the opportunity to do it yet, we're actually going to scaffold them in. And so we're going to use a peer or a teacher to help to scaffold the skills so that they can actually move into the next phase. So that zone of proximal development is really the big idea for Vygotsky. Now, like every other theory, there's also some critiques about Vygotsky's theory. Now, one of the biggest ones is that his entire theory is based on observation, not on scientific evaluation. And this critique, again, would also work really well for Piaget's theory. The other thing is that his theory assumes that everyone plays an active role in knowledge acquisition, but it really kind of fails to take a look at genetics to a large degree, because genetics really impact our acquisition of language and also play a role in cognitive development. And so for some kids who are developing at a cognitive pace that is behind their peers, Vygotsky's theory doesn't actually provide a really meaningful answer for why they don't. And I mean, the reality is that they cannot play the same active role in knowledge acquisition because they do not have the same cognitive reserves. So, and then in terms of language, he really minimized the role of genetics in the acquisition of language, and he really focused only on the social or cultural influences to the exclusion of some of the other lenses that we've talked about before, levels of analysis that would be helpful. Now, I'm going to pause here, and we are going to pick up in a little bit about some stuff that is also occurring during conception, and we will then go and have ourselves some good discussions about that. So I'm going to pause here for now, and we will talk soon.